Well, I'd like to welcome our audience back to the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to pass the baton over to our Associate Curator, Brooke Norton.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We would like to start by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huichon, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders both past and present. There is no question that our society is poised at a moment of change. We see it when fellow Americans are unjustly detained, when our citizens are wrongly harmed, and when our communities are in the streets for months on end protesting in order to be heard. The Badè Museum of Biblical Archaeology and Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley wish to acknowledge the pain and outrage of our community members who bear the weight of existing in a society designed to work against them and feel the devastation most keenly. Here at the museum and at ARC, we have been moved by the courage of those most deeply affected and the tenacity of those protesting for change. The Badè Museum and ARC stand in solidarity with the African American community. We join you in your calls for justice. Collectively and individually, our staff condemns the police brutality and systemic racism that has long been enacted against the Black community and other communities of color. It has persisted for too long. It has resulted in the unjust and premature ending of lives. So let us say their names: Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Let us as organizations be perfectly clear. Black Lives Matter. We lend our thoughts and actions to those who every day actively work to make this statement a living, breathing ideal, and to those who continually live the reality of racial injustice. Likewise, we lend our expertise to the cause by incorporating BLM-sensitive material into our exhibits, programming, and curriculum. We know very well that this moment has been a long time coming, and we are in the fight for equality, justice, and accountability. Through this lecture series, we aim to raise awareness of Ancient Nubia, a vibrant region in Northeast Africa with a rich archaeological and historical legacy. Learning about the ancient peoples of Nubia is one way to decenter the usual academic focus on Egypt and biblical and classical lands in order to reconceptualize the past. Decolonizing our views of the past, as through the research presented in the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series, we hope will lead to a more just present and equitable future.
Thank you very much. And now it's my distinct privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Rennan Lemos, who recently completed his PhD in Egyptian and Sudanese archaeology at the University of Cambridge, where he was a Cambridge Trust Scholar and member of Emmanuel College. His thesis, entitled Foreign Objects in Local Contexts, Mortuary Objectscapes in Late Colonial Nubia, explores the roles of standardizing sets of Egyptian-style objects in the shaping of diversity in Nubia under Egyptian colonial rule. Presently, Rennan is a European Research Council postdoctoral fellow within the Diverse Nile Project at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where he carries out research on mortuary sites in northern Sudan. He has taught at undergraduate level at Cambridge and has extensive excavation experience in Egypt and Sudan. Dr. Lemos's presentation today is entitled Decolonizing New Kingdom Nubia Through Its Material Culture. So let's bring a big internet welcome to Dr. Lemos. And Rennan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this kind of presentation, introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak in this very amazing lecture series, which so far has discussed very interesting and important topics. So let me start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. So my lecture has been advertised as Decolonizing New Kingdom Nubia. But what does it mean? The title is willingly provocative. Decolonizing is everywhere today, and some would even say it became a metaphor. However, Decolonial theorists would say that it's actually a good thing that decolonizing is everywhere and in many forms. As Walter Mignolo says, there is no decolonizing recipe. However, most decolonizing efforts in theory and practice in archaeology, and more specifically in our field of Egyptian and Sudanese archaeology, could benefit from a more comprehensive discussion of the theory involved. And that is my aim today. So, I should probably say that my paper has actually a different title, which is more descriptive of what I will do. My paper is entitled, Can We Decolonize the Ancient Past? Bridging Post-Colonial and Decolonial Theory in Ancient Nubia. I will discuss the different trajectories of post-colonial and decolonial theory in archaeology, while providing New Kingdom Nubian examples of the application of both bodies of theory, which entail different things. However, at the end, I will propose a way to bridge post-colonial and decolonial theory and practice to the benefit of us all writing alternative histories from our offices or doing collaborative fieldwork in Sudan. Post-colonial theory provides a critical framework that allows archaeologists working around the world to identify inequalities created by colonialism in the societies we study. According to Lydon and Brisby, it also allows us to confront the legacies of colonization in the form of persistent structural inequalities, including, for instance, the intersection of race and access to healthcare today. These inequalities originate from the colonial experiences of our countries, and I come from Brazil, what decolonial theorists would refer to as coloniality. In archaeology, such inequalities are expressed in the way heritage is managed, usually excluding local communities, descending or not from past groups, living in the vicinity of archaeological sites. Post-colonial theory helps us criticize the history of inequalities that produce and define heritage today towards new conceptualizations and practices. Post-colonial theory has played an important role in scholarship focusing on New Kingdom Nubia, despite not always being explicitly acknowledged as such. Post-colonial archaeologies also include critical assessments of the history of the discipline within colonial frameworks of thought and action. Although crucial to identify and address colonial historical inequalities in our field, the process of reassessing Egyptology and Nubian studies' colonial past has been described as decolonial, which reflects our field's blurred understanding of what post-colonial and decolonial actually entail. Post-colonial theory is a body of ideas and methods that originate in anti-colonial movements, expressed in publications such as Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and Messezer's Discourse on Colonialism, among others. Post-colonial with a hyphen can also denote the historical period following the last independence movements, although a more precise meaning of post-colonial denotes a body of theory rather than a specific period in time. Moreover, post-colonial scholars would find it problematical to characterize our time as post-colonial with a hyphen, given the enduring effects of colonialism experienced especially by minority groups across the globe today. Post-colonial scholarship in general, and post-colonial archaeologists more specifically, are essentially political, just like any scholarship. It has been described as a kind of activist writing, committed to understanding the relations of power that frame colonial interactions and identities, and to resisting imperialism and its legacies. This is mostly exemplified by the work of the Holy Trinity of post-colonial theory, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Omi Baba. Said's Orientalism focused on Western representations of the so-called Orient, and how such representations were connected to discursive conceptions of an allegedly superior culture, that is, Western, which used such representations to build on an exotic, weird, inferior other. Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, makes explicit the implicit references to silenced groups who were denied an official voice in colonial discourses and social structures of power. This allows us to unveil the structural and symbolic violence of colonizers against colonized, and try to retrieve alternative histories from the viewpoint of the silenced. The latter can only be accessed indirectly via textual sources dominated by Western intellectuals who did not attempt to hear such voices. Baba is probably the most influential post-colonial voice in archaeology. His essays in The Location of Culture develop a theory of cultural hybridity resulting from various forms of colonization, which leads to cultural desires and exclusions. As a committed body of theory, Baba's work laid the foundations for us to confront colonial claims of purity of certain cultures over others. Rather, hybridity bridges the colonial divide by emphasizing the creative potential of third spaces in colonial situations. Post-colonial theory has become largely centered on the closely related notions of representation and discourse. This has been criticized, among others, by decolonial thinkers. Archaeology, in this sense, has the potential to bring the material experiences of colonization into post-colonial discussions via material culture towards an understanding of past silenced groups, independent of how they do or do not appear in colonial narratives. Recent archaeological research emphasizes the role of artifacts beyond representation. For instance, the roles performed by foreign objects in local contexts towards the creation of alternative social realities based on the same, though transformed material forms. Post-colonial archaeologists aim to reconsider colonialism from the perspective of the colonized, subaltern, silenced actors not reflected or deliberately misrepresented in colonial narratives, or contest and confront colonialism and its legacies. Therefore, post-colonial archaeologists have broadly resulted in one, alternative bottom-up narratives about past societies, especially indigenous and ancient and subaltern groups. These past groups, which have not participated in the construction of colonial narratives, are mostly accessible via material culture, which allows us to reconstruct subaltern experiences of colonization and inputs towards the constitution of alternative social realities beyond those described by ideological textual sources. Two, the awareness that colonial situations cannot be reduced to neat dualist representations of colonizers versus colonized, in the words of Van Dommelen. This perspective, which derives mostly from Homi Bhabha, has played a major role in archaeological interpretations of colonial situations across the world. And three, the critique of colonial traditions of thought and strategies for restitution and decolonization. Here lies a potential common ground between post-colonial and decolonial thinking, which suggests that post-colonial criticism of the history of colonial disciplines, such as archaeology, anthropology, and Egyptology, works as a first step towards reparations. These reparations can take shape, for instance, as restitution of looted artifacts now in Western museums, and collaborations between archaeologists and local communities. Decolonizing efforts became common across many academic disciplines. In Sudanese and Nubian archaeology, such efforts overlap to some extent with post-colonial theory, which has produced blurred notions of what both post-colonial theory and decolonial thinking actually are, and their different trajectories and aims. Post-colonial theory and decoloniality intersect at least in 3 points. The first is the recognition of the lived effects of previous colonialism materialized in the inequalities and necropolitics that dictate minority groups' experiences today. For instance, slavery resulting in structural racism materialized as police assassination of poor Black people in my hometown, Rio de Janeiro, or throughout the United States, currently denounced worldwide by Black Lives Matter. Another point of contact between post-colonial and decolonial theory is the recognition of the failure of decolonization, which moved previous colonized societies towards nationalism. Nationalism impacts the writing of post-colonial narratives and attempts to decolonize the practice of archaeology. The third contact point, there are likely others which I have not acknowledged here, is the use of post-colonial criticism as a methodology to overcome coloniality and establish ethics. Besides the various points of contact, decoloniality's trajectory differs from post-colonial thinking. Decoloniality derives from the recognition of coloniality, which is different to colonialism, addressed and criticized by post-colonial studies, and about starting, in Walter Mignolo's words, decolonial healing. This can be achieved, for instance, through art, and Nubia scholars are in the process of finding their own ways, mostly through engagement with local communities and their artistic, analytical, and managerial inputs to heritage and history. Escaping coloniality, that is, delinking oneself from the colonial matrix of power, the very definition of decoloniality by Mignolo, is not simple. First, we need to understand what coloniality is. Retracing its genealogy allows us to realize the fundamental differences between post-colonial theory and decoloniality. Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano was the first to develop the concept of coloniality. While post-colonial theory focuses on colonialism and its effects upon subaltern groups in colonial situations, silenced by colonizers in discourse and practice, Quijano emphasized the coloniality as a major power structure that started with the colonization of the Americas in the turn of the 16th century, but outlived colonialism in the sense that our world is shaped not by the effect of the past colonization, which lies in the realm of post-colonial interpretation. Instead, coloniality's power structures are the very same inequalities that started with colonialism and survive to this day through the Eurocentric notion of modernity. Modernity is anchored in philosophy, European philosophy. I think, therefore I am, which created Cartesian dualism that separates us from the other, humans from nature, subjects from objects, and established science, European science, as the only way of thinking and doing and inhabiting the world. Please, I'm not contesting science here, go get your jabs whenever you can. I'm simply discussing the dualism that characterizes European rationality as universal, which automatically places this specific way of being in the world, the European way, as the only possible valid way. Now the ontological turn is taking other ontologies seriously and opening space for alternative ways of understanding and inhabiting this world in equal terms. Fruitful ways of establishing what Catherine Walsh termed a pluriverse as opposed to universe, lie, for instance, in traditional African and diasporic naturalistic worldviews, or indigenous forms of creating relationships with nature, for instance, Amazonian perspectivism, in which both Homo sapiens and other species are seen as human. Decoloniality is not decolonization. As I previously mentioned, decolonization refers to the process of independence of former colonies, a process that resulted in various forms of nationalism, which reproduced coloniality instead of promoting emancipation of former subaltern groups. The concept of decoloniality was later developed from the writings of Quijano, mostly by Mignolo. Decolonizing has nothing to do with decolonization, but with decoloniality, which is the process of delinking ourselves from coloniality. In Mignolo's words, decoloniality turns the plate around and shifts the ethics and politics of knowledge. Critical theories emerge from the ruins of languages, categories of thought, and subjectivities, Arab, Aymara, Hindi, French and English, Creole and the Caribbean, Afrikaans, etc., that had been consistently negated by the rhetoric of modernity and in the imperial implementation of the logic of coloniality. On the other hand, border thinking is one important way for us to situate ourselves in scales of categorization of coloniality. On the other hand, exploring the potential of what Catherine Walsh termed decolonial cracks is crucial for us to build a truly emancipatory pedagogy that will allow us, in her words, to unlearn the rational modernity that deformed me to learn to think out in the fissures and cracks. In archaeology, decoloniality allows us to situate the roles of scholars, communities, and heritage in scales of coloniality. It also allows us to act towards removing these actors, including ourselves, from the colonial matrix of power that reinforces the subaltern position of local communities living in the vicinity of sites and scholars in former colonized countries. The subaltern character of both local communities and scholars outside the European and North American mainstream is based on colonial, Eurocentric ways of thinking and doing still enacted today and considered as universal rules over local forms of being in the world. Post-colonial archaeologies offer us ways to critically revise and interpret past colonial situations. It is difficult to identify post-colonial narratives of New Kingdom Nubia or Nubia in general, especially within Egyptology, considered here in broader terms to include the study of Nubia. Theory has mostly been implicit in the writings of early scholars, and the discipline's modus operandi is still much focused on typologies and descriptions rather than theoretical explanations of social logics. Around the world, post-colonial archaeologists have helped scholars to rewrite historical narratives of colonial situations from the perspective of the colonized. In Egyptology, such narratives are rare, given the deep-rooted emphasis upon the Egyptianization or acculturation of local Nubian populations in the New Kingdom colonial period. An exception to the rule is Stuart Smith's seminal 2003 book, Wretched Kush. Even though the book is not explicitly treated as an example of post-colonial scholarship, it has set the foundations for later bottom-up explanations of the New Kingdom colonial period in Nubia from the perspective of local populations interacting with foreign cultural patterns. This interaction included phenomena like adoption, modification, and resistance, the last topic being usually avoided in Egyptology, which Stuart has pioneered in our field. Wretched Kush is an analysis of the ideological nature of colonial discourses about the other. These discourses allow little to no room for the colonized to appear other than as inferior in relation to colonizers. Smith then brings into the equation pictorial and archaeological sources that allow us to give voice to silenced Tibetan groups in colonized Nubia, therefore unveiling their input to cultural interactions, which are always two-way avenues rather than a process of civilizing the barbarians. Smith's interpretation of Nubian cooking wares in New Kingdom colonial contexts is especially significant as it allowed us to realize Nubian cultural resistance and identity in daily life, something completely absent from ancient and modern colonial discourses about and interpretations of Nubian history. This paved the way for current discussions on cultural interactions favoring Nubian agency, which have allowed archaeologists excavating in Sudan and writing histories of New Kingdom Nubia to account for the experiences of colonization, which were complex and involved a series of cultural and social frameworks from which different groups picked or rejected elements. In the New Kingdom, the ancient Egyptians colonized Nubia from the first to the fifth cataracts, although scholars are still working to define the southernmost limits of the ancient Egyptian colonial empire in the New Kingdom. Following an initial period of reconquest of earlier fortifications in Lower Nubia and military expansion further to the south, the Egyptians defeated Nubians from Kerma, then establishing their power in the Middle Nile as early as the beginning of the 18th dynasty, as demonstrated by evidence from Sai Island. From the mid-18th dynasty, Egyptian colonizers erected a series of temple towns along the river. These settlements did not just materialize the cult of Egyptian deities on local ground, but also worked as major colonial administrative centers, housing officials working for the Egyptian colonial administration, as well as indigenous communities, as demonstrated by recent stable isotopic analysis at various sites, namely Tombos, most especially Tombos and Sai. Colonial towns were surrounded by an approximately 5-meter thick wall, which seems to have not fulfilled any defensive role, though. The original plan of such towns included a main stone temple, a second cultic area, magazines and other administrative buildings and houses. From an architectural point of view, these settlements follow Egyptian standards, although local agency materialized, for instance, in the adaptation of house plans and later urban development outside the surrounding wall at Amara West. Large cemeteries were associated with colonial settlements, where Egyptian-style shaft tombs were excavated in the bedrock. A rectangular vertical shaft usually led to multiple subterranean chambers housing several intimates deposited in extended position, accompanied by Egyptian-style material culture. Large non-elite cemeteries are also known in New Kingdom Nubia, of which the main example is Phadros. At the cemetery of Phadros, multiple pit graves were excavated, housing mostly extended bodies with few associated Egyptian-style objects. Other types of tombs were also excavated at the cemetery, also following Egyptian standards. Material culture was a major supporting element of the Egyptian colonization in Nubia. Objects traveled from Egypt towards the south and ended up in towns and cemeteries. Egyptian-style objects from New Kingdom Nubia include various pottery types, burial containers, including wooden coffins, sarcophagi, mat coffins, and pottery coffins, funerary masks, shabtis, hot scarabs, various jewelry types, weapons, tools, cosmetic utensils, etc. These circulating global objects triggered change on local ground. together with architecture and the transition from flags to burials deposited on funerary beds inside tumuli, typical of previous Nubian traditions, to Egyptian-style tombs containing extended burials. Various categories of Egyptian-style objects excavated throughout Nubia worked as basis for colonial interpretations of Nubian colonial society based on the concept of Egyptianization or acculturation. And here you see the most clear example in these citations from Reisman. On the contrary, a post-colonial perspective allows us to propose alternative, bottom-up narratives that include not just local agency in context of cultural interactions, but also account for the transformation of imposed patterns to fulfill local expectations. Probably the most striking example that I've found of this subversion of imposed colonial patterns is a group of clay shabtis bearing a white headband from Aniba, which I argued express local identity through the local transformation of foreign material culture. On local ground, the patterns of the colonized can also be used as evidence for Nubia's internal diversity and complexity, which were disregarded and homogenized by both ancient Egyptian discourses and iconography and Egyptocentric approaches to Nubian past colonial realities. My talk on transformations of objects for Sudan Ancient and Modern seminar series at Oxford is available on YouTube. Here I would like to offer an example from a current research within the Diverse Nile project in Munich, which from a post-colonial perspective allows us to shift the balance and put forward alternative historical narratives of colonial Nubia. The opposition between centers and peripheries originated with word systems theory in the 70s and has been criticized by post-colonial narratives of word history for its essentialized binarism. Center-periphery perspectives have usually guided Egyptological interpretations of Nubia, especially during the New Kingdom colonial period, in which Nubia was considered marginal to the Egyptian center in a variety of ways. This is because most of the discussed evidence for New Kingdom Nubia comes from large cemeteries associated with colonial centers of administration, despite fieldwork carried out in areas such as the Batn al-Hajar or the area south of the Dal Cataract. Evidence from the hinterland of colonial towns or peripheral areas such as the Batn al-Hajar are usually discontinuous and propose various challenges to interpretation. Edwards recently raised a discussion on the role of isolated tombs in such areas. According to him, mortuary evidence from such locations, in contrast with evidence from formal cemeteries, and I quote, should not narrow our perspectives to the exclusion from our narratives of the vast majority of the population who are buried otherwise. The current Diverse Nile project at LMU Munich, led by Julia Budka, investigates a large area in North Sudan from the villages of Atab to Furka. Then the concession area is shown currently on the slide. The project aims to expand our knowledge of New Kingdom colonial Nubia by bringing into the narrative the vast majority of the population addressed by Edwards, which have remained mostly silenced in historical narratives produced by a discipline traditionally focused on the alleged civilization brought to Nubia by the Egyptians during the New Kingdom. In the Diverse Nile concession area, evidence for formal cemeteries and associated with established settlements is scarce, although continuing research and excavations will likely shed more light on this topic. In the New Kingdom, the whole area between Amara West and Lower Nubia, comprising the North Abri Delgo Reach and the Batn al-Hajar, represents a gap in our knowledge of New Kingdom Nubia, which has been built based on a focus on colonial administrative centers at the expense of alleged peripheries. Revisiting the evidence produced by various surveys in these areas is crucial for us to develop new comparative research. Evidence from the Diverse Nile concession holds the potential to shed light onto alternative material experiences of colonization beyond the binary division of centers and peripheries. An example comes from Guinea's West, which is located just north of Amara West on the way to the Batn al-Hajar. At Guinea's West, André Villa's team excavated tomb 3P50, dating from the New Kingdom. Based on a first look at the material culture retrieved inside, I would say it was used especially in the later part of the New Kingdom. The tomb was cut at the intersection between the alluvial plain and bedrock, and a few supporting slabs were used to reinforce the four subterranean chambers accessible through a descending passage. The tomb was heavily looted, with scattered bones found in the descending passage and in chamber 3. The tomb likely housed the burials of various contemporaneous individuals, as well as later burials. Julia Budka recently detected traces of a tumulus superstructure, and Michaela Binder highlighted the existence of later New Kingdom tombs combining Egyptian-style substructures with tumuli superstructures at Amara West, Guineas, and potentially at Sesame. The material culture from tomb 3P50 suggests cultural affinities with both Egypt and Nubia. On the Egyptian side, there are figurative scarabs, pendants representing deities and animals, including a rare crocodile pendant, an equally rare wooden headrest, and two late 19th dynasty shabtis of Isis, Lady of the House. Various types of beads were also excavated, including long beads and spaces, which are characteristic of elite cemeteries and monumental tombs in New Kingdom Nubia. However, various earrings made of shell and carnelian were also found, which represent affinities with local styles. The combination of Egyptian-style objects with stone, ivory, shell, earrings, and bangles is especially strong at Soleb. Tomb 3P50 did not belong to a formal cemetery, as its material culture alone would suggest. What is a relatively elaborate tomb containing a large quantity of restricted items typical of large New Kingdom colonial cemeteries, doing at Guinea's West. This evidence allows us to question the alleged peripheral character of areas in North Sudan, which would become centers of alternative material experiences of colonization in the New Kingdom. Shifting conceptions and experiences of imposed centers and peripheries allows us to rewrite historical narratives of Nubia in the New Kingdom based on local experiences instead of Egyptian ways of classifying history. If post-colonial theory offers us critical apparatus to understand and interpret past colonial situations from the perspective of previously silenced groups, decolonial thinking allows us to situate ourselves in and delink ourselves from the colonial matrix of power that defines our world system and produces hierarchies between geographical and social centers and peripheries. Decoloniality happens essentially in the present, while post-colonial criticism allows us to reinterpret the past, which can also have present-day implications. As previously discussed, theoretical approaches in Egyptology and by extension studies focusing on New Kingdom Nubia are rare. For the worse or for the better, theory has traditionally been implicit in Egyptological narratives of ancient Egypt and Nubia. Post-colonial studies of ancient Nubia in general and New Kingdom Nubia more specifically have not been explicitly addressed as such, although such studies paved the way for the critique of colonial traditions of thought and the writing of alternative histories of New Kingdom Nubia, emphasizing indigenous agency. Beyond alternative narratives of the ancient Nubian past, an example of which I try to offer based on my own work focusing on Egyptian-style material culture in New Kingdom Nubia, decolonial theory is still to make its way into studies of the ancient Nile Valley, especially considering Egyptology as a result of coloniality itself. In Emmanuel Honoré and Elena Garcia's words, the myth of the discovery of the pharaonic civilization is a modern misconception. More than addressing colonial situations, such as Nubia in the New Kingdom from below, decolonial thinking has been slowly occupying space in the Nile Valley in the form of community archaeology. In addition, there have been attempts to revisit archival material and disciplinary histories with the aim of impacting not only the way we write about the ancient past, but most of all, the way we position ourselves as scholars and practice our discipline within colonial disciplinary boundaries. Carruthers has recently revisited archival material produced during the UNESCO Nubian campaign. It demonstrates that archives produced during the UNESCO Nubian campaign represent the post-colonial with a hyphen context in which modern Nubian communities and their sites were usually ignored in the constitution of archaeological archives and historical narratives resulting from those archives, which only focused on the ancient past. The immense data sets produced during the UNESCO Nubian campaign only offer fleeting glimpses of Nubian communities just prior to their removal. Post-colonial with a hyphen denoting the post-independence period, archaeologies in Egypt and Sudan have traditionally ignored local communities within a nationalistic setting. State elite interests usually differ from those of local communities, which results in removal from their traditional birthplaces. In Sudan, clashes between local communities and fighting against the construction of the Merawi Dam and archaeologists carrying out savage excavations express the current state of affairs in the Nile Valley, which can be understood within the framework of coloniality. Current excavations at New Kingdom sites in Sudan, as well as sites dating from other periods, are increasingly involving local communities in decision-making processes regarding the writing of local histories and the management of local heritage sites, which materializes, for instance, in children's books, a community center, academic books, and other resources in local languages. And here I'd like to highlight the work of Tomomi Fushia. Bradshaw's work demonstrated that the most common question local communities in Sudan and Nubia ask about archaeology is what's the benefit? Beyond collaboration, delinking Nubian archaeology from the colonial matrix of power also includes development informed by other ways of thinking about and doing things. Politically engaged decolonial archaeologists in the end will allow us to question colonial inequalities which today define what we understand as heritage. Decolonizing Nubian archaeology can also benefit from current debates in global history. Today, there is little space for non-European epistemologists to arise from the work of scholars outside the colonial mainstream. Although it is clear that being in the global south does not necessarily imply that scholars will bring alternative non-colonial epistemologies to the table. If post-colonial theory allows us to bridge centers and peripheries in the past, overcoming the binary division in practice today, which is a result of coloniality, it should also be at the center of discussions aiming to decolonize Nubian archaeology. Local Sudanese and Nubian epistemologies and forms of inhabiting the world are crucial for us to overcome modern colonial definitions and practices of archaeology and heritage in Nubia. Although inputs from worldviews of the African diaspora in the Americas are also important, especially in the light of the impact of the Atlantic slave trade in all parts of Africa. Modern rewriting histories of colonized Nubia in antiquity or reassessing the discipline's colonial ties and inappropriate interpretations, which lie within the scope of post-colonial theory. Decolonizing ancient Nubia is about how the ancient past is reenacted today. The Nubian past has been removed from the local contexts where it was produced, in archives, archaeological practice, and in history books. Post-colonial theory allows us to rewrite history books. Engaging with decoloniality brings reparation. No clear, explicit attempt to address post-colonial theory and decolonial theory has been published so far within Nubian archaeology, despite examples of the application of both bodies of theory to Nubian contexts. On the one hand, post-colonial archaeologies of Nubia have produced more complex historical narratives of the New Kingdom. Today, narratives clearly inspired by post-colonial theory, which remains implicit in those narratives, are shedding new light onto complex cultural encounters and shifting conceptions of centers and peripheries. On the other hand, decolonial archaeologies of Nubia have mainly focused on living communities in Sudan and the present-day nature of ancient remains. Current research projects in Nubian archaeology point towards an existing divide between theory and practice regarding post-colonial and decolonial thinking. The former focused on the past, the later dealing with present-day issues surrounding heritage. However, is it possible to decolonize the ancient past itself? Those not working in community archaeology projects are left with the discursive realm as the political arena. Post-colonial theory has been criticized for its emphasis on discourses and representations of colonizer and colonized, which are reflected in the theory-practice divide in Nubian archaeology. Nevertheless, the practical impact of scientific and historical narratives upon living communities cannot be denied, and historical interpretations of Egypt as an African country are extremely contested among the public. An example is the colonial scientific discourse about race and recent attempts to deconstruct it from a decolonial perspective. One could argue for these and other cases that a post-colonial methodological step is necessary to deconstruct the narratives that legitimize oppression prior to practical attempts to decolonize. Based on this, as a sort of conclusion, I would like to develop the idea of narratives of reparation, which I believe can help us to be more explicitly theoretical and assess the impact and decolonial potential of our histories of Nubia, especially in the New Kingdom, which can be politically useful in today's struggles for equity and reparation beyond addressing past inequalities in theory and practice. Narratives of reparation work as a bridge between a first theoretically informed critical step and action promoting our delinking from coloniality through our engagement with the past. Coloniality did not exist in the ancient past. However, it is undeniable that the ancient past worked as a crucial supporting pillar of modernity coloniality through narratives on the origins of Western civilization. Therefore, modernity and coloniality and the ancient past are essentially entangled. Revisiting the ancient past with a critical post-colonial mindset allows us not only to rewrite alternative histories, but also to contribute to the dismantling of the colonial matrix of power that generates social and academic inequalities precisely because narratives of reparation, politically conscious histories of the ancient world, attack an important supporting pillar of coloniality. Alternative histories of New Kingdom Nubia, as well as any other historical reality in the past, therefore become narratives of reparation in the sense that they contribute to opening space for present-day epistemologies, which help us shed light onto silenced past realities, which contribute to other ways of thinking about the past and managing its material remains today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for this fascinating and thought-provoking talk. So we have some questions coming in.
Sorry, Rennan, do you mind unsharing your?
Oh yeah, sure.
Your presentation. Thank you.
Has it worked?
So how can we focus on or support alternative narratives, particularly in the classroom when discussing this material with both undergraduate and graduate students?
I think these questions are very difficult to answer because we are building such an approach, such alternative definitions and such alternative histories that have an impact in our lives today. And I think the way is just opening space for people who are thinking about things, people who have inhabited this world in a different way to speak up and to share their interpretations and their views of the past, which are intrinsically associated with the alternative for us from a point of view, from a Western point of view, alternative ways of being in the world. I think this is the thing that we all should start doing now, like listening to the different that has been silenced in colonial discourses and through coloniality in practice. But this is the collective effort. And I would like to stress as well that this talk is an essay. It doesn't provide any answers. It's a provocation. It's a starting point for us to just start thinking about things differently and include different voices, alternative solutions that have been excluded since forever.
I guess similar to this question, yeah, I don't know if it might be also a very difficult question to answer, but what sort of recommendations or what sort of best practices should scholars who are working in the field, particularly scholars who are working with the local populations, consider when they're doing their research?
I think that the answer lies within the communities, and then we look at the work of Tomomi Fushie, which I have mentioned previously. Like it's completely inspiring, very, very inspiring, because it just listens to opinions, to views, to interpretations that have not been at the center of narratives. So I think the solution is just going back to those who have been silent, not just in Sudan, not just in the Nile Valley, not just in Egypt, but everywhere in the world, because ways of thinking and doing in Amazonia, for example, are extremely inspiring to think, for example, about Egyptian religion. So, and we have never made associations like this, and I think this is the way forward, the decolonized way forward, maybe to create combinations that have never been tried.
So we have a question from Solange Ashby, one of our previous speakers. She asked, how widely do you think the interpretive framework that you propose has been adopted in the larger Egyptological community? And how might we encourage the adoption of this mindset in our discipline?
Hi, Solange, thanks for your question. I think approaches like this, theoretical approaches like this, and theoretical approaches in general have been pretty absent in Egyptology and in the Nile Valley in general. So it's difficult to assess the potential of such approaches, but I think we try. That's what we can do. And this lecture series as a whole have been discussing issues that have never been discussed openly before, which is great. So I think it's just about we collectively sitting together to think about things and to try to realize the potential of such approaches together. I don't know if I answered that, but yeah.
I think a lot of questions that were coming in are very similar, and we have another question that's focused a little bit more on particularly on the archaeological record. What is the best approach to the archaeological record to reorient interpretation through a lens of decoloniality, with the goal of arriving at alternative histories, focused on these local perspectives?
One methodological step, let's put it like this, it's just try to forget the norm, which is Egyptological, which is Egyptian. Forget the norm and look at things with your eyes, and you'll see, for example, that group of Shabdis that I showed previously. It was excavated a long time ago, in the 30s, I think, and it has always had a headband on its head, and it has never been paid attention before. And I've interpreted that as an expression of local identity through the material forms, the material culture that has been imposed to those communities living in Nubia. So people were subverting things, people were adding things that weren't common in Egypt in the same time period. People were changing material forms, people were adding bits and other parts to create completely different things that have been ignored if you just consider the norm that has been constructed for over a century now. Just forget the norm and look at things as they are, I would say.
Thank you. We have another question asking, does the interaction of a Western scholar with an indigenous community necessarily seed that community with colonial patterns of thought?
From extreme decolonial point of view, yes, we are all colonial. We are all colonialist. We are all colonial. We have been socialized since we were born through in coloniality. Coloniality has been going on like since a long time ago, and the rules that we learn since the beginning are the colonial rules. They have naturalized the way, the universal way, the Cartesian European way of being in the world as the way, and we have learned that since the beginning. So it's a process of. I really like the metaphor of the cracks and fissures that Catherine Walsh has developed. It's about exploring the cracks, and there are plenty of cracks in this unequal system that we live in. We just try to grow flowers from it. So, yeah.
So I guess following off of that question, is there resistance in the field at large towards adopting these new decolonializing approaches that create space for narratives of repeat reparations?
Well, we all say that Egyptology is a colonial field, and this has become common ground among people, but it's also simplistic. Egyptology is a disputed field, has always been a disputed field, I would say, at least in the past years. And it's difficult to say, no, there is overall resistance, maybe, but there are also various different voices and perspectives being put forward by people working everywhere in the world, in the US, in Europe, in South America. You know, it's just about pay attention to what these sometimes contradictory perspectives are to the discipline and to the way we do and think about things. You know, but I think it's simplistic to say that there is resistance to such approaches, you know, because the field is complex.
Another audience question asks, you talked about Amazonian, and I think that the new archaeological discoveries are very important to understand the ancient people who lived there. Is the decolonizing approach useful in this case?
In the case of Amazonian peoples, I wouldn't know. I have just read the theory that derives from local ways of, you know, dealing with the world and inhabiting and seeing, perceiving and experiencing the world, which are valuable for us to understand ourselves in the end. But I wouldn't know about this specific context. But the theory is there. I would recommend people to read anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, which has been discussing the Amerindian perspectivism. I think it's really interesting for us for us working with the ancient world in general.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's it for the questions. I think the audience is still digesting this wonderful talk. This concludes the lecture as well as our question and answer segment for today. Thank you so much to Dr. Lemos for sharing your time and expertise with ourselves and the wider public. Thank you also to all of our viewers for their interest in the scholarship and history and your efforts to engage in reconceptualizing the past. Please make sure to join us for the next part of the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia lecture series brought to you by the Badè Museum and ARF, which is scheduled for May 20th at 12 p.m. PST. Have a great day and thank you all.